seat, sir.
Good morning. How are you? So nice to see you, Danny. Nice to meet you, Patrice.
Someone has to.
Thank you.
Right? If you're not doing it, can you? Can you hear me? All right, if everybody could take their seats and put your headsets on.
Okay, thank you.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Lloyd Day. I'm the Deputy Director General of IICA. Welcome back to the home of sustainable agriculture of the Americas. Today we're going to talk about VACS. VACS is an exciting project. It's a global movement that began in 2023 in Africa. You got it, Edmi? Works? We started working with the State Department in VACS for Guatemala this year. It seems like it was a lot longer than May, but we've done a lot of work with the State Department and various partners, CIMMYT, lots of companies, to talk about how we can take the success in Africa, translate it into Central America, and hopefully expand it. So we're excited to have this conversation this morning, and so I'll turn it over to our partner in these morning editions and coffee chats, the Food Tank, and Danielle Nierenberg. Daniel.
Thank you, Lloyd. Good morning, everyone, and happy Food Day. Let's give a round of applause to that. There wasn't so many years ago that there was not a Food and Agriculture Day here at COP. So we've made a lot of progress, and that's thanks to a lot of the people in this room. Again, I'm Dani Nierenberg. I am co-founder and president of Food Tank. We're a research and advocacy organization really devoted to highlighting stories of hope and success in food and agriculture systems. That's why we are so excited to be partnering with and collaborating with IICA and Margaret and Lloyd and all of the wonderful staff here. Please give them a round of applause because they deserve it for coordinating a lot of great programming. So today we're going to talk about VACS, as we heard, but what we're really going to talk about is opportunity crops. And not so long ago, these were crops that were called orphan crops or underutilized crops. But what VACS does is sort of highlight the opportunity that these crops actually have. It's the U.S. State Department's vision for adapted crops and soils. So that the acronym is VACS, and it really seeks to build resilient food systems grounded in diverse, nutritious, and climate-adapted crops grown in healthy, fertile soils. And I would also add delicious crops, because I think that's really important, a part of this. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Patrice Anderson, a policy advisor in the Office of Global Food Security at the U.S. State Department. Please give her a round of applause. Siglin Snap is the Director of Sustainable Agri-Food Systems Programs at CIMMYT. Please give her a round of applause. And our good friend Margaret Ziegler, who is the representative for the United States for the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation in Agriculture. Round of applause. And again, a huge thanks to Margaret for putting on such great programming. So, Patrice, if I can start with you. I think, at least I feel like we tend to underestimate the complexities that our agriculture and food systems will encounter in both the short and the long term. Can you talk about, give us a sort of state of the plate, if you will, of how the climate crisis is exacerbating biodiversity loss and crop loss?
Yeah, sure. Oh, thank you so much. Hello. Okay. Thanks for that question. VACS is really about thinking about how climate change is shaping different outcomes in agriculture. We know that over 50% of most people's calories are coming from three primary staple crops: wheat, rice, and maize. And those staple crops are predicted to decrease in yield by 30% with climate change. In addition to this, we see a significant increase in soil degradation. And with this, we're also seeing a rise in deforestation as well. And all of these things are really affecting the biodiversity, both within the soils and also within the crops themselves. And so what VACS is really doing is really thinking about how do we think about soils and crops together? How do we think about the interdependency of soils and crops? And how do we think about preserving the biodiversity of these nutritious crops that are often underutilized, which we call opportunity crops? And how do we get people to both adopt them, and I was talking to Sig a minute ago, but thinking about both the supply and the demand side. So how do we build value chains for these crops, and how do we also have the supply come in at the same time, because these crops are so underinvested in?
Can you talk a little bit more about that challenge, that supply and demand challenge? Because that's really, I think, going to be the biggest part of this, right, to overcome?
Yeah, it definitely is. Our office has been thinking about several channels about how do we increase both the demand and the supply. And what do we think about first? Do we think about the demand, or do we think about this as the supply-driven problem? One of the primary reasons these crops have been so underinvested in is because they're not commercialized. Several of the crops on the VACS list are open pollinated varieties. Seed companies are typically not investing in them because people are not buying those seeds every season. Additionally, several policies around these crops are oriented towards monoculture systems, where we're not thinking about how do we diversify with legumes, or how do we diversify with cassava, et cetera. And so thinking about how do we change the policy narrative around things like agricultural subsidy programs, as well as national agricultural plans. And how do we really integrate these ideas into thinking about how do we supply more crops?
Sure, thanks. And I want to come back to the policy part in a minute. But Sig, if I can turn to you, Patrice mentioned, that we're very dependent on these starchy staple crops, these three crops that she mentioned. How do we go from really filling people up with these starchy staples to actually nourishing them? And you had an event in DC recently called Crops That Nourish, and I'm wondering if you can sort of talk about the changes that need to be made to make sure that we're investing in these opportunity crops.
Oh, sorry.
So good morning, all. I think that it not only is it Ag and Food Day, but we're starting to see interest in soils, and it goes back to soils, because if we don't, it's not only starch that is a challenge for people, although important calories, but also all the little tiny animals in the soil also need that nutritious. If we're going to get soil carbon sequestration, if agriculture is going to become a net negative, actually a carbon sink, actually, instead of the 30% of greenhouse gases that currently come from agriculture, then we have to get the soil right.
Right.
And that, actually, the funny thing is that people think that soils and microbes, we can just add a magic X-layer, we can just add inoculum, and the soils will get better. But in fact, where do microbes live? They live in plant roots. So it comes back to crop diversity. So healthy roots means healthy microbes, which means healthy soil, which means healthy people. So it's people, plants, and soils together. And so what's really VACS gets right, I think, is that we need to diversify that whole nexus. And much of the policies and such have really promoted cheap calories, which, of course, cheap food. We want people to be, the Green Revolution was about filling,
Sure.
Feeding so many people, saving so many people. But now we're moving on to, okay, so let's also nourish the planet through, but it will take even our traditional crops like maize, as the Maize Wheat Center, being dual purpose and being grown together with beans and being grown with the type of beans that in the past we just bred them for yield, but now we're breeding them for improving the soil.
Right.
So it really takes thinking about the system. In the end, it comes back to plants, people, and soils as systems that is more nutritious.
Thank you, Sig. Margaret, Sig has emphasized this people, plants, and soil, and I want to talk to you, take a step back and talk about the people part of this. Can we just sort of give an overview of how the climate crisis is impacting farmers, especially in the Americas?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Danny, and thanks everyone for coming today. I've been going to Guatemala for 25 years for various programs and visits and connections with people in Guatemala. And we've seen over the years, particularly in Central America, particularly in the dry corridor, the incredible increase in severity of drought, intense storms, just lack of capacity from rural people to be able to deal with these issues. And it has caused increasing malnutrition. I mean, nutrition never was great, but it's worse and worse every year. And we could probably even say it does cause a large amount of migration.
Right.
And it's causing destabilization of rural communities. And so I think one of the things that for me is important about VACS is it's not just a program, it's not a project, it's a mindset. What we're trying to do is not only in Central America, Latin America, but globally, really help shift the way we think about food. And I think Sig beautifully put it, that it's to nourish ourselves, all of us, and the planet, and the soil, and so that we can have better lives. It's really simple. And it's hard to do, though, because it's hard to change systems that are in place. We have some really good systems that produce food, in large amounts. We have some good systems. But I would say that this going forward needs to be the new vision.
Sure.
We have to adapt those crops not only for the soils, for our health, for just a better life for people in rural areas especially. And the exciting thing is, and I've seen it in Peru and to some extent in Ecuador, communities in the Andes that have preserved a lot of these, the crop diversity, are now really doing a great job with linking those to markets, linking those to new opportunities, restaurants, food products. It started a little bit with quinoa. It's moving to many other crops. Some of the best restaurants and most exciting restaurants in the world are in Lima. Hello, thank you we have a person from Peru in our audience. He's nodding his head. Amazing food, a lot you can do with it. How can that be scaled and expanded? How can more people take advantage of these amazing crops that exist? How can we make them more resilient? How can we make it easier for those crops to get to market and more affordable?
Right, absolutely. So you mentioned VACS as a mindset. Lloyd mentioned it as a movement. And I'm Dr. Carrie Fowler's biggest fan, the sort of visionary behind VACS. But I am, I don't know if concerned is the right word. I don't know how we convince ag ministries, health ministries, governments as a whole to take this on as a movement. So Patrice, maybe what are your thoughts on that? And I'd like for you all to answer.
One of the things about our expansion into Guatemala is it's the first time that we've really focused in on one country and looking at one agricultural system and choosing one VACS crop kind of to rally around, which is beans in all of their varieties. And I think this specialized approach that we've taken in Guatemala, specifically working with IICA, also working with other partners who are on the ground, working very intensely with the Ministry of Ag, and explaining the concept of VACS and having a continuous presence on the ground has really made a big difference. So I think to really impact or to move VACS from this global movement where people are talking about it, but we're not seeing actual policy changes, it's really going to take continuous effort at the country level, working with government representatives, having those conversations, continuously explaining what VACS is and what VACS is doing on a concentrated effort like we're doing in Guatemala, which I'm really excited about.
Sig, how does CIMMYT look at sort of that you're creating lots of projects on the ground, creating those examples? How do you envision incorporating VACS into some of the work that you're doing?
So at CIMMYT, we're very committed to public, private, and civil society partnerships. I really do think it takes all at the table. This is where people's agency comes back. So yes, there's government ministers, such as in Ethiopia, really, really interested in making investments in soils that are basically geo-targeted. In the past, it's been all or nothing, like either soils, rehabilitating soils is the thing of the day, or then it's too hard and we go on to the next thing. But it's about practical investments so that there's profit at some point, so that it does sometimes takes a few years with soils, but at some point it becomes, then it allows people to be able to cope with drought, cope with flooding. So the government starts to see that shift, right? But it is not just government alone. There's startups there. Lursha is one example in Ethiopia that is really helping extension reach more people with innovations in extension that are not prescriptive. They're not telling farmers what to do. Again, it's people's agency.
Right.
So civil society has agency really at its heart. And so here you also see these public, private, and civil society, which I think is really critical for this movement to make the next steps.
Sure. On this point of agency, Margaret, I imagine especially in the Americas, because women and women farmers have been sort of cultivating and preserving these opportunity crops for millennia, that they will be an important part of this. Can you talk about sort of how women's groups and women farmers will be a huge part of the VACS movement?
Yes. So I'll back up just a bit to give you the context of what happened with Guatemala. So in February, I was out in a very cold, freezing retreat out in a farm in the eastern shore of Maryland with Anna Nelson and a number of other people. And she came up to me and she said, "We want to work with IICA in Guatemala on VACS." And I said, "When?" She said, "Now." So we were so excited to begin working and actually taking the vision, and there's a lot to do on the ground, right? So one of the most important pieces of that, of course, was to bring in the Ministry of Agriculture, which State Department and others and IICA have been working on. So we had our first consultation, wide-ranging consultation in Guatemala City in May with over 120 participants from women's groups, indigenous groups, smallholder farmers, private sector, local private sector, government, NGOs, everybody. It was a great meeting. Following that, we've held at least two, I think there's a third consultation in the actual target zones of Guatemala where we're hoping to be working. And the ministry is very involved, Ministry of Agriculture. But so are civil society groups. So we had a meeting in Quetzaltenango and also in the Western Highlands and also in Chiquimula near the dry corridor. So those consultations are ongoing. There's a building and growing interest in this.
Right.
And at all of those meetings, we specifically reach out to and include women farming groups, smallholders, and youth, and indigenous people. So we have a really broad constituency that we're building in the country, and that we're building it from the ground up, not just from the top down. We're also including, as I mentioned, private sector. Local private sector is going to be really key to make this happen. So we've moved really quickly in just about 8 months.
Right.
And the priority crop, which was identified by everyone, but particularly Ministry of Agriculture, but the growers as well, is the bean seed system and all varieties of beans, particularly as an example, Ayacote bean, to make it a lot more nutritious, looking into breeding, looking into connecting that with soil health. As Sieg mentioned, you can't just do a crop or the soil. You've got to do it together with other crops. Maize is so important for Guatemala. So we're really going to be focusing on just a few elements. We're not going to go broadly with a ton of opportunity crops. We really want to focus on the soil health, the bean systems, and markets, and those key groups, women, youth, and indigenous people.
Sig, you looked like you had another comment on that.
Well, I really appreciate the systems approach. People do not grow beans alone, but we obviously, actually my research in the past was on beans, so I really think it's fantastic that we're focusing on that personally, because I think it's really the leverage point. But beans are grown around maize, so we really need to start to breed. They're actually looking at breeding for intercrops.
Yeah.
And even though that's one of the most widespread systems in the world, China, it's strip intercrops throughout Central America. It's both rotations, but also physically two crops growing together. And yet that's never been bred for before. So I'm super excited to see that happening.
That's great. I want to go back to something Margaret said about youth. And I want to sort of focus on farmers' incomes. And Patrice, maybe you can take this on. For this to work, right, it really has to be not so risky for farmers. It has to raise their incomes. They have to have those markets. Those are kind of difficult things, difficult infrastructure to build, I imagine.
Very difficult. And I think this is one of VACS's primary concerns where we're thinking about this from a systems approach, as Margaret said, thinking about how do you crowd in all of the support from both the private sector, because without the private sector, VACS is not going to flourish.
Right.
But also thinking about ways to build the demand for these crops in a way that really integrates and speaks to what policy is doing as well. So, for instance, in Zambia, people are starting to Zambia's agricultural subsidy program is starting to incorporate legumes into their subsidy program to addition to maize. So when we think about policies like that, that automatically builds a demand for these legume crops. And so things like that I think are really important when we're thinking about markets, is how do we influence the private sector through policy as well.
And that kind of example can be spread throughout sub-Saharan Africa, especially if it works in Zambia.
Yeah, subsidy programs are a very political topic.
Yeah.
But I think when you can make small headway like that to show the success of these programs and how it really does increase the demand, I think we have a really big opportunity there.
I'm hoping you can all talk about, so we've talked about the private sector, but the private sector is, there's local private sector and then there's, international private sector. Is there any concern that VACS could be co-opted in a way that is not sort of beneficial for farmers and the planet?
Margaret, do you want
I think we really are going to need private sector, whether it's local or international, to make that pull, to create that pull, that demand. I'm wondering, this is just off the top of my head, if like a company like Goya could be talked into, marketing some of just the new specialty IICA beans from Guatemala. Like, it could be like a start, to create some new products that could come from local.
Right.
But I think, I don't know. I co-opting, I'm not sure is the best word. I think I would say that the only concern would just be that only one particular type of bean would be focused on.
Sure.
What we want to try to do is have a diversity.
Yeah.
Have a menu of options for growers. I think they're going to be needed, though. The private sector is going to be needed to the local private sector, really, to help work with, let's say, marketing these as nutritious or tasty, or maybe some new products for the urban market in Guatemala City, school feeding programs. You're going to need all of them to come along and help make the system work, make the market system work.
Thank you. Patrice, the school feeding programs have been a big part of sort of selling this, so to say, in sub-Saharan Africa, right?
Yes, they have. You want me to elaborate on that a
Yeah,
little
can
bit?
you talk about what that looks like?
Yeah, so we've had a little bit of investment from donors such as Cargill and some other private sector donors who are looking to basically have VACS crops be the source for school feeding programs. And so that builds another component of the demand side, where if we have this identified market, school programs, then we have a place to offset where those crops are growing. Additionally, this also helps future generations be invested in thinking about what these crops taste like, and they're delicious, and they're coming home to their parents saying, hey, I had this at school, I want this at home as well. And so we're really thinking about it from that standpoint.
That's great, that you build in that market for procurement. That
Yes,
really
exactly.
makes it powerful. I'm wondering, if there are examples of farmers that you can share, Patrice, that are, have been really excited about this. Individual farmers who, are taking this on as the movement that we talked about before.
I was recently in Tanzania, and we saw a lot of projects focused around grain amaranth, which is not a typical crop that you would see grown in Tanzania. So I was very, very fascinated by what made farmers want to actually grow this crop. And one of the main reasons for the uptake in grain amaranth was two things. One, they found ways to create value addition. So they found that if they added this grain to cassava flour, that it made wedding cakes more tasty.
Nice.
And not only did it make it more tasty, but it was also very nutritious. It increased the nutritional content of a wedding cake. I don't know if people are thinking about the nutritional content when they're thinking about wedding cakes, but that was one of the selling points. Additionally, they ran a public health campaign that talked about the benefits of grain amaranth for iron, I believe. But the public health campaign made people say, oh, I heard that this is going to help something in my blood. That's what I heard from farmers.
Nice,
So this idea that, one, you can build in value addition by adding it to a crop that's already being utilized in the market, but also you can really build a health campaign and show that this crop is adding to the nutritious content, it's adding something valuable to your overall health, has really demonstrated uptake in the crop itself.
Yeah, that reminds me that the communication part of this, the awareness building part, is really going to be powerful. Sig, do you want to comment that, and Margaret as well?
Yeah, I'd like to bring in a whole nother component because there are reasons people haven't always grown these crops.
Right.
Right. I mean, we know we don't always eat for nutrition, although we should. Although actually, there's a great tradition of high nutrition at a wedding. Actually, in Kenya, lab, which is another orphan crop, is actually traditionally given to wives and the new wives because obviously it's high iron. It's good for your fertility. So there's that. But I was actually going to talk about mechanization because we're really looking at how, if we're going to be inclusive, if youth is going to get excited about this vision, then it has to be easier to grow some of these crops. Things like maize are traditionally grown partly because they're high, they suppress weeds, so they're lower labor. Versus amaranth and some of these other crops, we need to bundle them with de-risking things like insurance, but also with mechanization so that youth get excited and it doesn't become the drudgery. So we have to have an inclusive vision. To me, sometimes inclusion is not just training people like finance, like banks, to realize that women and youth might be good investments.
Right.
So it takes a certain amount of research around how to make sure banks are there to help support so that the mechanization can make this a more inclusive movement.
Absolutely. That finance part is really important. Margaret, awareness and education so that people understand that these are good for the soil, good for the planet, tasty. I think that has to be, I'm going to go back to that, the joy of eating has to be a huge part of this. How do we increase that awareness?
Well, again, I'm going to go back to Peru as a great example of, I just had a chocolate bar that had kiwicha in it. I don't know if it made the chocolate bar more healthy, but it was so interesting because it had kind of a grainy,
Like crackly?
Crackly.
Yeah.
It was fantastic. And I thought, well, at least I'm getting some dark chocolate and I'm getting a little bit of kiwicha here. So this is nice. But that is an example. This is a great marketing. It's national pride. It's, it's fantastic example. And so, this has got to be part of any VACS movement. We've got to really think holistically. It's not just going to be about breeding better beans and sticking them in the soil. It's just not. It's got to be holistic. And that's why, again, I go back to all the partners that we're assembling on the ground in Guatemala. We've included, representatives from World Vision and schools who are really going to be thinking about how to do this in the school system. Catholic Relief Services working there. They work with local partners. So really getting the best ideas, letting it come up from the ground in terms of what can be created, what can be done with the products, how can we create innovative products that are good to eat, exciting for kids, and within a system where we can have that economic draw.
Right. Patrice, when I started hearing about VACS, one of the things that excited me was that this is something that could outlast, and I know that it's difficult for you to speak to this, outlast any administration, outlast any sort of political kind of turmoil, because it is a movement. It is something that countries are taking on, companies are taking on, that community groups are taking on, that it can sort of snowball into its own sort of effort.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that the foundation of VACS, how it was established using 4 implementing partners, including Crop Trust, CGIAR, FAO, and EFAD. They're very large international institutions, and I think that was a great plan before that preceded me when I was at VACS. But additionally, I think what VACS has also done is to make sure that there's continuity in VACS across administrations. We have established a governing body with CIMMYT and FAO. So that really takes it so that the ownership is not owned by the U.S.
Right.
And despite who our administration is, there's continuity in programming, there's continuity in vision, and it doesn't go away after one administration leaves.
It gives me so much hope. Thank you for clarifying that. Go ahead, Margaret.
Just on that same point, this is where I do think we have to work with the private sector because they are interested in this. There is a VACS Champions program. I know ADM, Cargill, IBM, Walmart, PepsiCo. I mean, they're big companies, but they have an interest in improving food systems, I think, and they want, for their supply chains, I think they are trying to make some of their products better.
Yeah.
And this is an opportunity for them. So it's, if they can be champions not only in the program, the vision implementation, but in advocacy for us with governments, that can be helpful.
Of course, Sig. Thank you, Margaret.
I also want to mention that there's these community of practices where the researchers particularly are geeking out, but we're working with private sector representatives. In my own one on soils, we have from Southern Africa a number of fertilizer and long-term Opticam. They've been there for 200 years. So it is about public-private, but also particularly the community of practice is more about research. Like, how do we make this move beyond? I mean, we have to be honest that the greener revolution didn't happen in certain parts of Africa. We didn't reach the last mile.
Right.
And so this time we're trying to make sure that the varieties, they have to be a little different. They're not just high yield, they're nutritious, and some of them improve the soil as well as being able to grow in degraded soils. So it's a bit more inclusive, and that is partly because the community practices are really trying to take opportunity to think long term about how to embed this.
That's great, and that's such an important part of this movement. I want to end with something hopeful and a call to action for negotiators and participants at COP, and what you expect, the outcomes for VACS from this COP will be, and on the road to Belém. So Patrice, could you go first?
Yeah, so one of the things that we're really hoping with VACS is, like I said, VACS is a movement. It's not a program. I think one of the things about it being started inside of the State Department is we are not USAID, so we're not a programming office. And while the U.S. government has given a lot to VACS, we're really about bringing groups and organizations together. VACS, like I said, is a movement that thinks about soils and crops that are interdependent on each other. And we're really hoping that as people think about programming, they stop thinking about it in the siloed manner. They don't separate just soils, they don't separate just crops, they don't separate just water projects, but they're really thinking about the agricultural system as an integrated system. And that is really our main hope. So we hope that people join VACS in the thought process of changing this siloed thought process about agricultural development.
It's such a great opportunity. I mean, that's what opportunity crops are. It's such a great opportunity for all those things to happen. Thank you, Sig.
Yeah, I wanted just to bring attention to Brazil, since we're all thinking about Brazil. And Brapa, their research effort, has always been one of my heroes because they came up with a new type of soybean that needed less fertilizer many years ago by transdisciplinary work. So it was economists working with microbiologists, working with breeders. So it was kind of an early VACS. And so, as we know, they took the soybean industry by storm. But now they're looking at cover crops, and just like there's a picture over there of these conservation agriculture with soybean. So I think that, you were worried about co-opting. But to me, if we broaden the options, like some of these opportunity crops literally have been made into almost pathetic versions of themselves because people were trying to breed them to be like maize wheat. And there's nothing wrong with maize wheat, but we have maize wheat.
Sure.
So we have to breed some of these crops to be a whole new type, like pigeon pea as a bush, not as a pathetic soybean that doesn't have the insect tolerance that soybean has.
Sure.
So I think that the fact that we're breeding for a more of a systems perspective, these new options, farmers will take them.
Yeah.
Private sector will take them. Civil society will take them to new places, as long as we keep in mind that these are a new type of crop, and they have their own unique way to make the planet a bit better. So I am very excited that this is really biologically sound, but it's also systems oriented.
Absolutely.
And people as the main agency.
Absolutely. Margaret, final word.
Yes. Well, thanks again, all of you, for coming, for doing this. The program's moving. It's happening. It's going to survive. I believe that. It's going to just take different shapes in every part of the world. It's going to look different in Latin America than it does in Africa. And that's exciting. That's what it's about. You have no one size fits all. So I think our push right now is to get the story out about what could be done, excite people's imaginations. And on that note, Ingo, I'm going to ask you to put up a slide. We are going to be having a networking happy hour today. So come back here today at the end of the day, network with us to talk about VACS. At 4 o'clock, we're going to have a wonderful interview with Minister of Agriculture from Dominica. And he's going to share a bit about resilience in his country. And right after that, we will have a time for networking to talk about VACS. So please share this word today with your friends and colleagues. And I'll end it on that. And I'll just say thank you to Danielle again for always doing such a great job to moderate.
Thank you all so much. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you all.